The rusted metal box slipped from Elena Vasquez's trembling hands, spilling gold coins and revolutionary documents across the dusty floor of the hidden cellar she'd just discovered beneath her inherited ranch, coins that bore the unmistakable markings of Pancho Villa's lost treasure, the very war chest that historians had spent decades trying to locate. 3 weeks ago, she was a struggling farm worker in California's Central Valley, and now she stood in a secret chamber that could rewrite the history of the Mexican Revolution while making her one of the wealthiest women in Texas. The scorching July sun beat down mercilessly on the cracked earth of Esperanza Ranch as Elena surveyed the property that had somehow become hers through an inheritance she still couldn't fully comprehend. The lawyer's letter had arrived at her tiny apartment in Fresno like a bolt from the blue, informing her that her great-uncle Joaquin Morales, a man she'd heard mentioned only in whispered family conversations, had left her a 2,000-acre ranch along the Texas-Mexico border. The timing couldn't have been more perfect or more suspicious. Elena had been laid off from her job at the vineyard just 2 months earlier, victim of another corporate buyout that prioritized profit margins over the families who had worked the land for generations. Her savings account showed a balance that wouldn't cover another month's rent, and her ancient Honda Civic had started making ominous grinding noises that spelled expensive repairs she couldn't afford. The inheritance letter seemed too good to be true, which, in Elena's experience, usually meant it was. The drive from California to the remote corner of Texas had taken 3 days, with Elena sleeping in her car at rest stops and surviving on gas station coffee and convenience store sandwiches. Every mile southward had felt like traveling backward in time, from the manicured suburbs of California through the vast emptiness of New Mexico and into the rugged borderlands where civilization seemed to thin out like morning fog. Before we continue with Elena's incredible discovery, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love hearing from our global community. And if stories about hidden treasures and family secrets intrigue you, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow we've got an absolutely mind-blowing story about a woman who inherited a lighthouse and discovered it was the center of a century-old smuggling operation. Esperanza Ranch sat isolated in a valley between low hills, 15 miles from the nearest town of San Marcos, and close enough to the Rio Grande that Elena could see the dust clouds kicked up by Border Patrol. Vehicles making their regular rounds. The property looked like it had been abandoned for years, with fences sagging under the weight of tumbleweeds and outbuildings that seemed to be held upright more by habit than structural integrity. The main house was a sprawling adobe structure that had probably been impressive once, but now showed the effects of Texas weather and decades of neglect. Red tile shingles had slipped from the roof, creating gaps that would let in rain when the sparse desert storms arrived. The wooden porch wrapped around 3 sides of the house, its boards weathered to a silvery gray that spoke of countless seasons of baking sun and occasional flooding from the nearby creek. Elena had expected to find the house empty, but as she approached the front door with the ornate iron key the lawyer had provided, she noticed signs of recent habitation. A newer pickup truck sat in the shade of a mesquite tree, and smoke drifted from the kitchen chimney despite the oppressive heat. Someone was living on her property, and they apparently had no intention of leaving just because ownership had changed hands. The man who answered her knock was tall and weathered, with silver hair and the kind of deep tan that came from a lifetime of outdoor work. His clothes were clean but well worn, and his boots showed the scuffs and repairs of someone who worked cattle for a living. Most striking were his eyes, pale blue and sharp with intelligence, studying Elena with an intensity that made her suddenly aware of how out of place she must look in her city clothes and impractical shoes. "You must be Elena," he said, his voice carrying a slight accent she couldn't quite place. "I'm Miguel Santos. Your uncle hired me as ranch foreman about 5 years ago. I've been maintaining the property since his death, waiting for someone from the family to claim it." Elena shook his offered hand, noting the calloused palms that confirmed his story about ranch work. "I appreciate you keeping the place up, Mr. Santos, but I wasn't aware my uncle had employees. The lawyer didn't mention anyone living on the property." Miguel's expression grew carefully neutral. Joaquin was a private man who kept his business arrangements informal. "I've been living in the foreman's quarters behind the main house, keeping the cattle fed and the fences mended. The ranch has been running itself mostly, but it needs decisions only the owner can make." This was Elena's first indication that inheriting the ranch might be more complicated than simply signing papers and deciding whether to sell or keep the property. The presence of cattle suggested ongoing expenses and responsibilities she hadn't anticipated. Her plan had been to assess the ranch's value, list it with a real estate agent, and use the proceeds to start fresh somewhere else. "How many cattle are we talking about?" Elena asked, following Miguel as he gestured toward the pastures beyond the house. "About 200 head, mostly Black Angus with some crossbred stock. Your uncle was selective about his breeding program, focused on cattle that could handle the heat and sparse grazing out here. They're good animals, worth perhaps $150,000 at current market prices." Elena felt a flutter of excitement despite her exhaustion. If the cattle alone were worth that much, and the land had any value for development or agriculture, she might be looking at enough money to buy a small farm somewhere with better water and soil than California's Central Valley could offer a woman with her limited resources. They walked through the house together, Miguel pointing out recent repairs he'd made and systems that would need attention soon. The interior was surprisingly spacious and well-built, with thick adobe walls that kept the rooms cool even in the afternoon heat. The furniture was sparse but solid, heavy pieces that looked like they'd been made by local craftsmen from native woods. "Your uncle spent most of his time in the study," Miguel explained, opening the door to a room lined with bookshelves and dominated by a massive oak desk. He was always reading about local history, collecting stories about the old days, when this was still frontier country. The study felt different from the rest of the house, more personal and lived in. The desk was covered with papers, books lay open as if Joaquin had just stepped away for a moment, and the walls were decorated with old photographs showing cowboys, cattle drives, and what looked like revolutionary soldiers from the early 1900s. One photograph in particular caught Elena's attention, a group of armed men on horseback, with a caption written in Spanish that she couldn't quite make out. Was "My uncle interested in the Mexican Revolution?" Elena asked, studying the photograph more closely. Miguel's pause was almost imperceptible, but Elena noticed it. Joaquin was fascinated by border history. This area saw a lot of action during Villa's raids, and there are plenty of stories about treasure and hidden caches from those days. Most folks around here grew up hearing tales about revolutionary gold, though nobody's ever found any actual proof. Elena filed this information away, remembering family stories about Joaquin's eccentricities and his obsession with local folklore. Her grandmother had always described him as the dreamer of the family, more interested in chasing legends than building a practical life. Yet somehow he'd managed to accumulate a substantial ranch and maintain it for decades. Mr. Santos, I need to be honest with you. I don't know anything about running a ranch, and I'm not sure I can afford to keep this place operating. I may need to sell the property to settle my uncle's estate and cover the taxes. Miguel nodded slowly, his expression understanding but sad. I figured that might be the case. City folks usually don't want to take on the challenges of ranching, especially out here where water's scarce and the markets are unpredictable. If you do decide to sell, I'd appreciate some notice to find another position. Elena felt guilty about potentially displacing someone who had obviously cared for the property faithfully, but her financial situation left little room for sentiment. She needed to make practical decisions based on what was best for her future, not what would be most convenient for people she'd just met. That evening, alone in the main house after Miguel had returned to his quarters, Elena began going through her uncle's papers more systematically. The desk drawers contained the usual ranch business, veterinary records, feed bills, tax documents, but also boxes of correspondence with universities, museums, and historical societies. Joaquin had been more than casually interested in local history. He'd been conducting serious research. One folder contained copies of letters between Joaquin and professors at the University of Texas, discussing archaeological surveys of the ranch property. Another held correspondence with the Texas Historical Commission about potential landmark designations for sites on the ranch. Most intriguing was a series of letters with a Dr. Sarah Martinez at UT's Center for Mexican-American Studies, discussing oral histories collected from families in the area about revolutionary activities. Elena was beginning to understand that her uncle's interest in border history wasn't just hobby collecting, but serious academic research that had attracted attention from professional historians. The ranch might have historical significance beyond its agricultural value, which could complicate any plans to sell quickly. As she continued reading, Elena discovered that Joaquin had been corresponding with treasure hunters as well as academics. Several letters came from people claiming to have information about Pancho Villa's lost war chest, offering to share details in exchange for permission to search the ranch. Joaquin's responses were politely skeptical, but Elena noticed he'd kept every letter, suggesting he took the possibility more seriously than he let on. The most recent correspondence, dated just weeks before Joaquin's death, came from a man named Roberto Fuentes, who claimed his grandfather had been one of Villa's soldiers and had passed down specific information about a cache hidden somewhere in the area that would become Esperanza Ranch. Fuentes had offered to provide maps and detailed directions in exchange for a 50-50 split of any treasure found. Joaquin's reply was cautious but interested. He'd agreed to meet with Fuentes to examine the supposed evidence, but according to the letter's date, that meeting would have taken place just days before Joaquin's sudden heart attack. Elena wondered if the meeting had actually occurred, and, if so, whether Fuentes had shared information that might explain her uncle's intensified research in his final weeks. Elena spent the rest of the evening exploring the house more thoroughly, looking for any additional documents or evidence of her uncle's research. In the closet off the master bedroom, she found boxes of geological surveys, metal detector equipment, and what appeared to be hand-drawn maps of the ranch property marked with notations in Spanish and English. The maps were particularly interesting because they showed features that didn't appear on the official ranch surveys. cave systems, rock formations, and areas marked with symbols that might indicate previous excavations or points of interest. One map showed the location of several buildings that no longer existed, including what appeared to be a chapel or shrine near the current house site. By midnight, Elena was exhausted, but far too stimulated to sleep. The picture emerging from her uncle's research suggested that Esperanza Ranch might be sitting on top of one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in Texas history. The possibility of finding Pancho Villa's lost treasure was probably remote, but even without gold, the historical significance of the property could make it valuable to museums, universities, or the state historical preservation system. Elena finally fell asleep on the living room couch, surrounded by maps and documents, her mind spinning with possibilities that ranged from financial security to adventure to historical fame. She had no way of knowing that her presence on the ranch had already been noticed by people who had their own interests in Joaquin's research, and that her inheritance would soon involve her in dangers her uncle had spent years trying to avoid. The next morning would bring visitors who would change everything Elena thought she understood about her inheritance, her family, and the hidden history buried beneath the Texas desert. The morning sun was already blazing through the kitchen windows when Elena woke to the sound of vehicles approaching the ranch house. She sat up on the couch, disoriented and stiff from sleeping, surrounded by her uncle's research materials, and peered through the curtains to see two black SUVs kicking up dust clouds as they navigated the rutted driveway. The vehicles looked official and expensive, completely out of place in the rustic ranch setting. Elena quickly gathered the scattered documents and maps, stuffing them back into their boxes with a sudden instinct that she shouldn't let strangers see what she'd been studying. Something about the way the SUVs had approached, fast and purposeful, suggested this wasn't a casual neighborly visit to welcome the new owner. The first person to emerge from the lead vehicle was a woman in her 40s, dressed in a crisp business suit that must have been sweltering in the Texas heat. She wore dark sunglasses and moved with the confident stride of someone accustomed to being in charge. Behind her came two men in similar professional attire, both carrying briefcases and scanning the property with the systematic attention of security personnel. Elena opened the front door before they could knock, hoping to control the conversation by meeting them on the porch rather than inviting them inside, where they might notice her uncle's research materials. "Good morning. Can I help you?" The woman stepped forward with a practiced smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Ms. Vasquez, I'm Victoria Sterling with Sterling Development Group. These are my associates, James Chen and Robert Mitchell. We're sorry to disturb you so early, but we have a time-sensitive business proposition that I think will interest you greatly." Elena kept her expression neutral, despite feeling immediately suspicious. How did this woman know her name, and why? Was a development company approaching her less than 24 hours after she'd arrived at the ranch? "I'm not sure what kind of proposition you could have. I only inherited this property yesterday, and I haven't made any decisions about its future." Sterling's smile became more genuine, though still calculating. "That's exactly why we're here, Ms. Vasquez. We understand you're a practical woman who's inherited an asset you may not be equipped to manage long-term. Sterling Development specializes in helping people in exactly your situation convert inherited properties into immediate financial security." One of the men, Chen, stepped forward with his briefcase. We've prepared a comprehensive offer for your ranch that would allow you to walk away today with a substantial cash payment, free of all the responsibilities and expenses of ranch ownership. No dealing with cattle, no maintenance costs, no property, taxes, just a clean transaction that sets you up for life. Elena felt her pulse quicken despite her wariness. If these people were legitimate, they might be offering exactly what she needed, a way to convert her inheritance into cash without the complicated process of learning to run a ranch or finding buyers for cattle and equipment. But something about their eagerness and the speed of their approach set off alarm bells. That's very generous, but I'd need to know more about your company and what you plan to do with the property. I've only been here one day, and I haven't even had a chance to properly assess what I've inherited. Sterling exchanged a quick glance with her associates. Of course you'd want details. We're a legitimate development company with projects throughout Texas and New Mexico. This property interests us because of its location near the border and its potential for alternative energy development. Solar installations, wind farming, that sort of thing. The explanation sounded reasonable, but Elena noticed that Sterling had avoided providing specifics about their company or showing any identification. Professional developers would typically offer business cards, references, and detailed project proposals, not cash-on-the-spot deals to someone they'd never met. What kind of financial offer are we discussing? Elena asked, curious to see how far they'd go with their pitch. Mitchell opened his briefcase and withdrew a folder containing what appeared to be legal documents. We're prepared to offer $2 million for the property, including all buildings, equipment, and livestock. The offer is contingent on immediate acceptance and closing within 72 hours. Elena's breath caught. $2 million was far more than she dared hope the ranch might be worth, enough money to buy a small farm anywhere in the country and live comfortably for years. But the pressure for immediate acceptance made her deeply suspicious. Legitimate business deals didn't require split-second decisions, especially for properties the buyers had supposedly never seen before today. That's a substantial offer, Elena said carefully, but I'd need time to have the property appraised independently and consult with attorneys before making such a major decision. Surely you understand that. Sterling's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Unfortunately, our development timeline requires immediate commitment. We have regulatory approvals and financing arrangements that depend on securing this property quickly. If you're not prepared to move forward today, we'll need to pursue alternative sites for our project. The high-pressure tactics confirmed Elena's suspicions that something wasn't right about this offer. She'd worked enough sales jobs to recognize manipulation when she saw it, and Sterling's approach had all the hallmarks of a scam designed to pressure people into poor decisions. I appreciate your interest, but I'm not making any decisions about this property until I've had time to understand what I've inherited and explore all my options. If your offer is legitimate, it should still be available after I've done my due diligence. The temperature on the porch seemed to drop several degrees as Sterling's friendly mask slipped. Ms. Vasquez, I think you may be underestimating the challenges of ranch ownership, especially for someone with no agricultural experience. This area has unique complications that make it difficult for outsiders to operate successfully. The veiled threat was unmistakable, but before Elena could respond, Miguel Santos appeared around the corner of the house, apparently returning from his morning chores. His presence seemed to surprise Sterling's group, and Elena noticed them exchange meaningful looks. "Miguel," Elena called out, grateful for the interruption. These people are from Sterling Development. They're interested in purchasing the ranch. Miguel approached slowly, his weathered face carefully neutral as he studied the visitors. Sterling Development? Can't say I've heard of you folks. Most of the development companies working in this area are pretty well known around here. Chen stepped forward aggressively. And you are? Miguel Santos, ranch foreman, been working this property for 5 years now. Miguel's tone was polite but firm. Ms. Vasquez, if these folks are legitimate developers, they should be able to provide references from other landowners in the area, permits from the county planning office, and documentation of their financing arrangements. Sterling's jaw tightened visibly. Mr. Santos, this is a private business discussion that doesn't concern ranch employees. Actually, Elena interjected, Miguel's input is very valuable to me. He knows this property and the local business environment better than I do. She turned to Sterling. I think his suggestions about references and permits are reasonable. If you could provide that documentation, it would help me evaluate your offer properly. Mitchell snapped his briefcase shut with obvious irritation. Ms. Vasquez, I think you're making a serious mistake. This property has complications you don't understand, and our offer represents your best opportunity to avoid problems that could prove very expensive or worse. The second threat was less subtle than the first, and Elena felt her temper rising. Are you threatening me, Mr. Mitchell? Sterling quickly intervened. Of course not. Robert simply means that rural properties often have issues that surprise. City buyers, water rights, mineral rights, environmental regulations, livestock diseases. We're trying to save you from potential headaches. Elena looked from Sterling to Miguel, noting that the ranch foreman's expression had become distinctly unfriendly as he studied the 3 visitors. His body language suggested he was preparing for trouble, which made Elena wonder what he knew about these people that she didn't. I think this conversation is over, Elena said firmly. If you want to make a legitimate offer for this property, you can contact me through proper channels with appropriate documentation. Right now, I'd like you to leave. Sterling's professional mask slipped entirely, revealing an expression of cold calculation. You're making a very foolish decision, Ms. Vasquez. This area has a history of unfortunate accidents befalling people who don't understand local realities. Your uncle learned that lesson too late. The implication that Joaquin's death might not have been natural sent ice through Elena's veins. But before she could respond, Miguel stepped closer to the visitors, with his hands visibly positioned near the tools on his belt. I think the lady asked you to leave, he said quietly. Texas hospitality only goes so far, and you folks have worn out your welcome. For a moment, Eleanor thought the situation might escalate into physical confrontation, but Sterling apparently decided discretion was the better part of valor. She gestured to her associates, and they began walking back toward their vehicles. This isn't over, Ms. Vasquez, Sterling called over her shoulder. You'll find that isolation makes people vulnerable to all sorts of problems. I hope you're prepared for the consequences of your stubbornness. Elena and Miguel watched in silence as the SUVs disappeared down the ranch road, leaving behind only dust clouds and an atmosphere of menace that seemed to hang in the morning air like smoke. Miguel, Elena said once the vehicles were out of sight, what did you make of those people? Miguel removed his hat and wiped his forehead, buying time to consider his words. They weren't developers, that's for certain. Real development companies don't show up unannounced with cash offers and threats. They also seem to know more about this ranch than strangers should. Elena felt a chill despite the growing heat of the day. What do you think they were really after? Hard to say, but I'd guess it has something to do with your uncle's research. Joaquin was careful about who he talked to, but word gets around in small communities. If he was getting close to finding something valuable, there are folks who'd want to claim it for themselves. This was Elena's first clear indication that Miguel knew more about Joaquin's activities than he'd initially revealed. How much do you know about my uncle's historical research? Miguel's expression became guarded. Enough to know he was looking for something specific, and enough to know that his search had attracted attention from people who don't respect property rights or family claims. Your uncle was worried about something in his final weeks, checking the perimeter fences more often and asking me to keep an eye out for strangers. Elena realized she needed to reassess her situation entirely. What she'd initially viewed as a simple inheritance decision, keep or sell a ranch, was apparently much more complicated. Her uncle had been conducting research that had attracted dangerous attention, and now that attention had transferred to her. Miguel, I need to ask you directly, do you think my uncle's death was really from natural causes? Miguel was quiet for a long moment, staring out across the ranch toward the hills, where the morning heat was already creating shimmering mirages. Your uncle was in good health for a man his age. He exercised regularly, ate well, didn't smoke, or drink heavily. A sudden heart attack wasn't impossible, but the timing was suspicious. Elena felt the ground shifting beneath her feet as the implications sank in. If Joaquin had been murdered because of his research, then her inheritance wasn't just property and cattle. It was a target painted on her back by people willing to kill to get what they wanted. What do you think they're looking for? Same thing your uncle was looking for, I'd guess. There are a lot of stories about revolutionary treasure buried in this area, and most folks dismiss them as folklore. But Joaquin had evidence that suggested at least some of the stories might be true. Elena thought about the maps and documents she'd found in the house, wondering if they contained information that could put her in even greater danger. Miguel, I need to know whose side you're on. Are you helping me because you're loyal to my uncle's memory, or do you have your own interests in whatever might be buried on this ranch? Miguel turned to face her directly, his pale blue eyes steady and serious. Your uncle saved my life once, about 3 years ago. I was working a job down in Laredo when some bad business deals went wrong, and I needed to disappear for a while. Joaquin gave me work and a place to stay, no questions asked, when I had nowhere else to go. I owe him more than I can ever repay. The answer felt genuine, but Elena realized she was going to have to make decisions about whom to trust based on incomplete information. Her uncle was dead, possibly murdered, and she was alone on an isolated ranch with people threatening her and a foreman whose background included unspecified trouble that had required him to disappear. What do you think I should do? Miguel considered the question carefully. If you're smart, you'll pack up and leave today, take whatever cash you can get for the cattle and equipment, forget about the land, and start fresh somewhere far from here. This isn't a game for amateurs, and the people involved don't hesitate to eliminate obstacles. Elena felt a surge of rebellious anger at the suggestion that she should simply abandon her inheritance because of threats from strangers. And if I'm not smart enough to run away? Miguel's expression shifted to something that might have been approval. Then you'd better learn quickly who your real friends are, and you'd better be prepared to fight for what's yours, because those people will be back, and next time they won't bother with polite conversation." As if summoned by Miguel's words, Elena's cell phone buzzed with an incoming text message from an unknown number. "Last chance to accept our generous offer. Tomorrow the terms change significantly. V.S." Elena showed the message to Miguel, who shook his head grimly. "They're not going to give up. Sterling and her people have invested too much time and effort in this operation to walk away because of one stubborn woman." Elena stared at her phone, realizing that her decision had already been made. She could run away and spend the rest of her life wondering what she'd given up, or she could stay and fight for her inheritance while trying to uncover the truth about her uncle's death. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. "Miguel, I'm staying. Whatever my uncle found or was looking for, I'm going to find it first, and I'm going to make sure the people who threatened us today regret ever coming to my ranch." Miguel nodded, slowly, as if he'd expected this decision despite his advice to leave. "In that case, there are things you need to know about this ranch that your uncle never put in writing. And there are preparations we need to make before Sterling's people come back." Elena felt a thrill of fear and anticipation as she realized her quiet inheritance had become an adventure that could change her life forever, or end it. Miguel led Elena away from the house toward a weathered barn that sat about a quarter-mile from the main buildings, explaining that they needed to talk somewhere Sterling's people couldn't easily observe or overhear them if they were using surveillance equipment. The barn looked like dozens of others scattered across Texas ranches. Corrugated metal roof, wooden siding bleached gray by decades of sun, and large doors that hung slightly askew on their hinges. Inside the barn, however, Elena discovered that appearances could be deceiving. While the front section contained the expected ranch equipment, hay bales, feed bins, and farming tools, the back section had been converted into something that looked more like a research laboratory than agricultural storage. Tables lined the walls, covered with geological equipment, metal detectors, ground-penetrating radar devices, and dozens of carefully labeled boxes containing what appeared to be archaeological specimens. "Your uncle spent more money on this equipment than most universities have in their entire archaeology departments," Miguel explained, watching Elena's amazed expression as she examined the sophisticated technology. He wasn't just interested in finding treasure. He was conducting serious scientific research into Revolutionary-era activities in this area. Elena picked up a handheld metal detector that looked like it cost more than her car, noting the specialized settings and digital displays that suggested capabilities far beyond anything a casual treasure hunter would need. How did he afford all this equipment on a rancher's income? Miguel's expression became uncomfortable. Your uncle had resources beyond what he made from cattle. His family had money, old money from mining interests in Mexico before the revolution. Joaquin's grandfather was forced to flee during the violence, but he managed to bring enough gold and silver north to establish himself in Texas. This revelation added another layer to Elena's understanding of her inheritance. She'd assumed her uncle was a simple rancher who'd developed an interest in local history, but apparently he'd been continuing a family tradition of involvement with revolutionary treasure that stretched back generations. Did my uncle find anything with all this equipment? Miguel walked to a filing cabinet and withdrew a thick folder containing photographs, maps, and what appeared to be official documentation from various government agencies. He found plenty, but nothing like what he was really looking for. archaeological. Artifacts, old building foundations, even some weapons and personal items from the revolutionary period. But the big prize, Villa's war chest, stayed hidden. Elena studied the photographs, which showed excavation sites around the ranch where Miguel and Joaquin had apparently been conducting systematic searches. The images revealed foundations of buildings that no longer existed, including what looked like a substantial structure that might once have been a church or community center. These excavations must have taken years to complete properly. About 4 years of steady work, mostly during the cooler months when the cattle didn't need as much attention. Your uncle was methodical about documenting everything, working with archaeologists from the university to make sure any discoveries were properly recorded and preserved. Elena noticed that several of the excavation photos showed areas that had been carefully filled in and disguised, as if Miguel and Joaquin had been concerned about hiding their activities from casual observers. "Were you worried about people learning about your searches?" Miguel's expression darkened. "Your uncle started getting interested visitors about 2 years ago. People claiming to be treasure hunters, historians, even government officials asking questions about his research. Most of them seemed legitimate at first, but Joaquin began to suspect that some were connected to more serious criminal organizations." Elena felt a chill as she realized the Sterling development visit might have been just the latest in a series of attempts to gain access to whatever Joaquin had discovered. What kind of criminal organizations? Drug cartels, mostly. The border area is full of smuggling operations, and any large cache of gold or silver would represent the kind of portable wealth that criminal organizations prize. If word got out that Villa's treasure was really hidden somewhere on this ranch, it would attract every dangerous person within 500 miles. The implications were staggering. Elena had inherited not just a ranch and some cattle, but potentially one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in American history, along with all the dangers that such a discovery would bring. No wonder Sterling's people had been willing to offer $2 million and make threats. They might be representing interests that valued the ranch's hidden treasure far more than its agricultural potential. "Miguel, I need to know exactly what my uncle discovered and how close he came to finding Villa's war chest. If I'm going to make intelligent decisions about this inheritance, I need complete information." Miguel hesitated, clearly weighing how much to reveal. "Your uncle found documentary evidence that Villa's forces buried a substantial treasure somewhere on this property in early 1916. Probably during their retreat after the Columbus raid. He had testimonies from family members who claimed their ancestors were present during the burial, maps drawn from memory by people who witnessed the event, and even some physical evidence that suggested the stories were true." Elena's heart raced as she began to understand the magnitude of what she'd inherited. If Pancho Villa's legendary war chest was really buried somewhere on Esperanza Ranch, its value would be measured not just in gold and silver, but in historical significance that would make it priceless to museums and collectors worldwide. What kind of physical evidence? Miguel walked to another filing cabinet and withdrew a small wooden box, which he opened to reveal several tarnished silver coins and what appeared to be a piece of military equipment, a brass button or insignia, bearing markings that Elena couldn't read, but that looked distinctly Mexican and military in origin. These were found in different locations around the ranch, but all in contexts that suggested they'd been buried deliberately rather than lost accidentally. Your uncle had them authenticated by experts at several universities, and they all confirmed that the items dated to the revolutionary period and were consistent with Villa's forces. Elena examined the artifacts, feeling the weight of history in her hands. These small objects represented connections to events that had shaped the entire Southwest, to the lives of people who had fought and died for causes they believed in deeply enough to risk everything. Where exactly did my uncle think the main treasure was buried? Miguel spread out a detailed map of the ranch on one of the work tables, pointing to several areas marked with different colored pins. He'd narrowed it down to 3 possible locations based on ground-penetrating radar surveys, metal detector readings, and analysis of the historical testimonies. Each site showed anomalies consistent with large buried caches, but excavating them properly would require more time and resources than he had available. Elena studied the map, noting that all 3 potential sites were located in areas of the ranch that would be difficult to observe from the main roads or neighboring properties. Villa's soldiers would have chosen burial locations that offered both security and the possibility of future recovery, which meant places that were defensible but also memorable enough to find again. Has anyone else seen this map or know about these specific locations? Miguel's expression became grim. That's where things get complicated. About 6 months ago, your uncle discovered evidence that someone had been conducting unauthorized surveys on his property. He found equipment marks, test holes, and other signs that professional treasure hunters had been working some of the same areas he'd identified as promising. Elena felt a surge of anger at the thought of thieves stealing her family's legacy. Did he catch anyone in the act? Not directly, but he did some investigating and discovered that at least 2 different groups had been using satellite imagery and advanced metal detection equipment to survey the ranch from neighboring properties. One group appeared to be legitimate archaeologists working with university funding, but the other group's background couldn't be verified. Elena realized that Sterling Development might represent the second group Miguel had mentioned. Their sophisticated approach and apparent knowledge of the ranch's significance suggested they had access to professional intelligence and substantial financial resources. Do you think Sterling's people are the ones who were conducting unauthorized surveys? Miguel nodded grimly. The timing fits, and their behavior today suggested they knew far more about this property than they should have from casual research. They've probably been planning this acquisition attempt for months, waiting for the right opportunity to approach whoever inherited the ranch. Elena felt the pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to fall into place. Her uncle's death might not have been coincidental timing. It might have been deliberately caused by people who wanted to ensure that his research would be interrupted and that the ranch would pass to someone they could manipulate or eliminate more easily than an experienced, suspicious elderly man. Miguel, I need to ask you something difficult. Do you really think my uncle's heart attack was natural, or do you think someone killed him? Miguel was quiet for a long moment, staring at the map spread across the table. Your uncle was healthy and active, but he'd also been under a lot of stress in his final weeks. He'd started carrying a pistol when he went out to check the cattle, and he'd changed his daily routines to make them less predictable. Those aren't the actions of a man who feels safe. Elena absorbed this information, realizing that her inheritance came with dangers she was only beginning to understand. If someone killed him, they're probably planning to kill me too, once they get what they want from this ranch. That's why I advised you to leave this morning. The people involved in this have already demonstrated they're willing to commit murder to achieve their goals. An inexperienced woman from California would be much easier to eliminate than your uncle was. Elena felt a flash of resentment at Miguel's assumption that she would be helpless against the same threats that had challenged her uncle. What if I'm not as helpless as they think? What if I'm willing to fight for what's mine? Miguel studied her carefully, as if reassessing his initial impression of her capabilities. Fighting back would require more than just courage. You'd need to understand exactly what you're up against, develop a strategy for protecting yourself, and be prepared to use methods that might not be entirely legal. Elena thought about her life in California, the constant struggle to make ends meet, the layoffs and corporate downsizing that had left her with no security or prospects for advancement. The threats from Sterling's people were real and serious, but so was the possibility that this inheritance represented her only chance to build a life with real meaning and purpose. What kind of illegal methods? Miguel's expression became very serious. Your uncle had been preparing to defend this ranch by any means necessary. He'd acquired weapons, surveillance equipment, and communication systems that would allow him to call for help if needed. He'd also made contact with certain individuals in the area who have experience dealing with criminal organizations and aren't constrained by normal legal procedures. Elena realized that Miguel was describing a small war that had been brewing beneath the surface of what appeared to be a simple border ranch. Her uncle had been preparing for armed conflict with people who wanted to steal his family's historical legacy, and now that preparation was her inheritance as much as the land and cattle. Show me what kind of preparations he made. Miguel led her to a concealed section of the barn, where a hidden panel revealed a cache of weapons, ammunition, and military-style communication equipment. The collection included rifles, pistols, night vision devices, and what appeared to be a sophisticated radio system capable of reaching law enforcement agencies as well as private contacts. Your uncle spent considerable money and effort assembling this equipment. He wasn't planning to rely on local law enforcement if Sterling's people or other threats materialized into direct action. Elena examined the weapons, noting that they were all in excellent condition and that ammunition was stored in quantity sufficient for a prolonged confrontation. Her uncle had clearly been preparing for a siege, not just casual threats. Did he teach you how to use all this equipment? Miguel nodded. Joaquin insisted that anyone living on this ranch needed to be able to defend it properly. I have military experience from my younger days, so the weapons training wasn't difficult, but the communication systems and surveillance equipment required more specialized knowledge. Elena realized that her decision to stay and fight for her inheritance would require her to learn skills she'd never imagined needing. But the alternative, abandoning the ranch to thieves and murderers, was unacceptable to someone who'd spent her entire life watching other people take advantage of her family's hard work and sacrifice. Miguel, I want you to teach me everything. My uncle learned about defending this ranch. I want to know how to use the weapons, operate the communication equipment, and implement whatever strategies he'd developed for dealing with people like Sterling's group. Miguel studied her expression carefully, apparently looking for signs of uncertainty or naivety that would suggest she wasn't serious about the commitment she was making. This isn't a game, Elena. Once you start down this path, there's no going back to a normal life. You'll be declaring war on people who have vast resources and no scruples about using violence to get what they want. Elena thought about the threatening text message on her phone and Sterling's barely concealed menace during their morning visit. The war had already been declared by people who viewed her as an obstacle to be removed. Her choice was between fighting back or becoming a victim. Then we'd better start preparing immediately. How long do you think we have before they escalate beyond threats? Miguel checked his watch and looked toward the ranch road where dust clouds were already visible in the distance. Based on that text message you received, I'd say we have less time than we hoped. It looks like we're about to have more visitors. The approaching vehicle was different from Sterling's black SUVs. A dusty pickup truck that moved at a leisurely pace down the ranch road, suggesting someone familiar with the property rather than aggressive strangers. Elena felt her muscles relax slightly as she recognized the difference in approach, though Miguel remained tense beside the concealed weapons cache. "That's Dr. Sarah Martinez," Miguel said, peering through the barn's side window. "She's the historian from UT that your uncle was corresponding with. If she's coming here now, it's probably because she heard about Joaquin's death and wants to discuss his research." Elena remembered seeing Dr. Martinez's name in several of the letters she'd found in her uncle's study. The correspondence had suggested a professional relationship built on mutual respect and shared academic interests. But Elena wondered what had prompted the professor to drive out to the ranch so soon after the funeral. They secured the weapons cache and walked back toward the house, arriving as Dr. Martinez parked her truck near the front porch. The woman who emerged was in her 50s, with graying black hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and the sun-weathered complexion of someone who spent considerable time doing field work. She wore khaki pants, hiking boots, and a field vest with multiple pockets that suggested she'd come prepared for outdoor activities. "Miguel, I'm so sorry about Joaquin," Dr. Martinez said, embracing the ranch foreman with genuine warmth. "I came as soon as I heard. The academic community lost a valuable ally when he passed." She turned to Elena with an expression of professional curiosity mixed with personal sympathy. "You must be Elena. Your uncle spoke of you often in our recent conversations. I'm Sarah Martinez from UT's Center for Mexican-American Studies." Elena shook the offered hand, noting the firm grip and calloused palms that suggested Dr. Martinez was accustomed to physical work as well as academic research. "Dr. Martinez, I'm pleased to meet you, though I wish the circumstances were different. Miguel mentioned that you and my uncle collaborated on historical research." Dr. Martinez glanced around the ranch property with the systematic attention of someone trained to observe and analyze landscape features. Joaquin was conducting some of the most important Revolutionary-era research I've encountered in 20 years of academic work. His combination of family oral histories, archaeological investigation, and documentary analysis was producing results that could reshape our understanding of Villa's activities in Texas. Elena felt a flutter of pride, mixed with apprehension, as she began to understand that her uncle's work had been recognized by professional historians as genuinely significant. What exactly had he discovered that was so important? Dr. Martinez paused, studying Elena's expression as if weighing how much information to share with someone she'd just met. "Perhaps we could discuss this privately. Some of Joaquin's discoveries have implications that extend beyond academic interest." Miguel intervened before Elena could respond. "Dr. Martinez, Elena's already had visitors this morning who made it clear that her uncle's research has attracted dangerous attention. She needs to understand exactly what she's inherited before she can make intelligent decisions about her safety. Dr. Martinez's expression sharpened with concern. What kind of visitors? Elena described the morning's encounter with Sterling Development, noting Dr. Martinez's increasingly troubled expression as the story progressed. When Elena finished, the professor was shaking her head grimly. I was afraid this would happen. Joaquin mentioned in his final letter that he suspected his research was being monitored by people with questionable motives. He'd started taking precautions to protect his discoveries from potential thieves. Elena felt her stomach tighten with apprehension. What kind of precautions? Dr. Martinez looked around the ranch buildings, then back at Elena and Miguel. Your uncle had begun concealing his most important findings and creating false trails to mislead anyone who might try to steal his research. He was particularly concerned about a group of individuals who'd been making inquiries about Revolutionary-era treasure sites throughout South Texas. Elena realized that her uncle's paranoia in his final weeks had been completely justified. Sterling's people weren't opportunistic developers who'd happened to hear about the ranch. They were part of a systematic effort to locate and steal Villa's treasure that had been underway for months or years. Dr. Martinez, I need to understand exactly what my uncle discovered and why it's valuable enough for people to threaten murder to obtain it. Dr. Martinez nodded decisively. In that case, I think you need to see the evidence your uncle shared with me before his death. But first, let me ask you directly, are you planning to continue his research, or are you considering selling the ranch to eliminate the dangers involved? Elena thought about Sterling's threats and the weapons cache Miguel had shown her in the barn. The smart thing would probably be to sell the property immediately and use the money to start fresh somewhere far from Texas. But the idea of allowing criminals to profit from her family's historical legacy was infuriating. I'm planning to continue my uncle's work and find Villa's treasure before anyone can steal it from my family. Dr. Martinez smiled with obvious approval. Good. Joaquin hoped you'd have the courage to see his work completed. He believes strongly that historical discoveries should benefit the communities they come from, not enrich criminals or private collectors. She walked back to her truck and retrieved a large canvas bag, which she carried to the porch with obvious care. Your uncle provided me with copies of his most important documents for safekeeping. He was concerned that his original research might be stolen or destroyed, so he wanted to ensure that his discoveries would survive even if something happened to him. Elena felt a chill at the implication that her uncle had been expecting to be killed because of his research. He knew he was in danger. He was worried enough to take precautions, yes. Joaquin had received several visits from people claiming to represent legitimate research institutions, but when he checked their credentials, he discovered that some were fraudulent. He'd also noticed signs that his property was being surveilled and that his mail might be intercepted. Dr. Martinez opened her bag and withdrew a thick folder containing maps, photographs, and documents that looked identical to some of the materials Elena had found in her uncle's study. These are copies of everything Joaquin shared with me over the past 6 months, including his most recent discoveries. Elena opened the folder eagerly, finding herself looking at detailed maps of the ranch property, marked with notations in both English and Spanish. The maps showed not only the current layout of buildings and fences, but also the locations of historical structures that no longer existed. This map shows the original settlement that existed on this property in the early 1900s, Dr. Martinez explained, pointing to building outlines that didn't correspond to any current structures. According to oral histories collected from local families, this was a substantial community that served as a supply depot and rest stop for Villa's forces during their cross-border raids. Elena studied the map, noting that the historical settlement had been much larger than the current ranch building suggested. "What happened to all these buildings?" Miguel answered, before Dr. Martinez could respond. "Most were destroyed during the U.S. military pursuit of Villa's forces in 1916. The army burned anything they thought might be useful to revolutionaries, and the local population was forced to relocate for their own safety." Dr. Martinez nodded. Confirmation. The destruction was systematic and thorough, which is why so few physical traces remain of what was once a thriving community. However, your uncle's archaeological work had begun to reveal the foundations and artifact patterns of the original settlement. Elena turned the page to find photographs of excavation sites that showed stone foundations, artifact collections, and what appeared to be the remains of a substantial building with thick walls and multiple rooms. "This was the chapel," Dr. Martinez said, pointing to the largest foundation. According to the oral histories, it served not only as a place of worship, but also as a meeting hall and storage facility for the revolutionary forces. Several witnesses claimed that Villa himself conducted strategy meetings in this building. Elena felt a thrill of excitement as she began to understand the historical significance of her inherited property. This wasn't just a ranch that happened to have some buried treasure. It was a site that had played an important role in one of the most dramatic periods of American and Mexican history. "Did my uncle find evidence that treasure was buried near the chapel?" Dr. Martinez exchanged a meaningful look with Miguel before answering. "He found evidence that something substantial was buried there, yes. Ground-penetrating radar showed a large anomaly beneath the chapel floor, and metal detection indicated significant quantities of metal objects in the same location." Elena's pulse quickened. Large enough to be Villa's war chest. Large enough to contain everything the historical accounts describe: gold and silver coins, jewelry taken from wealthy supporters of the federal government, religious artifacts, looted from churches, and weapons that were too valuable to abandon but too heavy to carry during rapid retreats. Elena stared at the photographs, trying to imagine the dramatic events that had unfolded on her property more than a century ago. Revolutionary soldiers burying their accumulated wealth in the desperate hope that they could return someday to reclaim it, never knowing that they were creating a mystery that would captivate treasure hunters for generations. Why didn't my uncle excavate the chapel site if he was so certain the treasure was there? Miguel answered with obvious frustration. He was planning to, but he wanted to do it properly with university oversight and legal protection. Joaquin was concerned that unauthorized excavation might damage important archaeological evidence or create legal problems with state and federal authorities. Dr. Martinez nodded agreement. Your uncle was meticulous about following proper procedures. He'd applied for archaeological permits and was working with the Texas Historical Commission to ensure that any excavation would be conducted scientifically and that discoveries would be properly preserved. Elena realized that her uncle's caution and respect for historical preservation had probably saved the treasure from being discovered by less scrupulous treasure hunters. But it had also delayed the excavation long enough for criminal organizations to learn about his research and begin planning their own acquisition attempts. How long would it take to get the proper permits and conduct a legal excavation? Dr. Martinez looked uncomfortable. Under normal circumstances, probably 6 to 8 months. But given the attention your uncle's research has attracted from criminals, I'm not sure you have that long to wait. Elena studied the maps and photographs, trying to understand the technical challenges involved in locating and excavating Villa's treasure. What would be required to conduct an unauthorized excavation quickly? Miguel and Dr. Martinez exchanged another meaningful look, clearly recognizing the implications of Elena's question. You're talking about treasure hunting rather than archaeological excavation, Dr. Martinez said carefully. It would be faster and simpler, but it would also be illegal without proper permits, and it would destroy valuable historical evidence that could never be recovered. Elena felt torn between her respect for historical preservation and her urgent need to find the treasure before Sterling's people could steal it. What if the choice is between quick excavation that destroys some evidence and letting criminals steal everything? Dr. Martinez was quiet for a long moment, apparently struggling with the ethical implications of Elena's question. Your uncle faced the same dilemma in his final weeks. He'd begun to suspect that waiting for permits might mean losing the treasure entirely to people who wouldn't hesitate to destroy the entire archaeological site. Elena sensed that Dr. Martinez knew more about her uncle's final plans than she'd revealed so far. What decision did he make? He'd started making preparations for an emergency excavation if it became necessary to prevent theft. Joaquin had acquired equipment and made contact with people who could help him conduct a rapid but careful search of the chapel site. Miguel confirmed this revelation. Your uncle had everything ready to begin excavation on short notice. The equipment is hidden on the ranch, and the people he'd contacted are still available to help if needed. Elena felt a surge of excitement mixed with apprehension as she realized that her uncle had left her not just a treasure map, but a complete plan for finding Villa's war chest before criminals could steal it. What kind of people did he contact? For help? Dr. Martinez hesitated before answering. Joaquin was pragmatic about the situation he faced. He'd made contact with individuals who have experience in unconventional archaeological recovery operations, people with military backgrounds who understand both excavation techniques and security procedures. Elena understood that Dr. Martinez was describing mercenaries or private security contractors who operated outside normal legal constraints. Her uncle had been preparing for a treasure-hunting expedition that would be as much a military operation as an archaeological dig. Are these people trustworthy? Miguel answered definitively. Your uncle wouldn't have worked with anyone he didn't trust completely. These are professionals who understand the value of historical preservation and who have personal reasons for ensuring that Villa's treasure ends up in the right hands. Elena realized that her decision about whether to continue her uncle's research had already evolved into a decision about whether to launch an expedition that would pit her against Sterling's criminal organization in a race to find one of the most famous lost treasures in American history. Dr. Martinez, if I decide to proceed with my uncle's emergency excavation plan, would you be willing to participate as the archaeological consultant? Dr. Martinez smiled grimly. Your uncle asked me the same question 2 weeks before his death. My answer then was yes, and it's still yes now. Villa's treasure belongs in a museum where it can be studied and appreciated by the public, not in the private collection of criminals who murdered a good man to steal it. Elena felt the pieces of her uncle's plan falling into place around her like the components of a complex machine designed for a single purpose. Everything she needed to find Villa's treasure was already in place. The research, the equipment, the expertise, and the personnel. The only thing missing was the courage to begin an adventure that could make her wealthy beyond imagination or get her killed in the process. When can we start? Elena walked the perimeter of the foundation, trying to imagine the building as it had existed more than a century ago. Revolutionary soldiers attending strategy meetings, local families gathering for religious services, and perhaps most dramatically, Villa's forces burying their accumulated treasure beneath the floor when retreat became necessary. Miguel had already begun setting up the ground-penetrating radar equipment, working systematically to scan the interior of the foundation for anomalies that might indicate buried objects. The equipment produced a continuous display of subsurface features, showing variations in soil density and composition that suggested different types of buried materials. "There," Dr. Martinez said, pointing to a distinctive pattern on the radar display. "That's the anomaly your uncle identified as the most promising location." Elena studied the display, seeing a roughly rectangular shape approximately 4 feet below the surface that was clearly different from the surrounding soil. The anomaly was large enough to contain substantial quantities of buried objects and positioned near what would have been the altar area of the chapel. "How do we know that's not just building materials or natural rock formations?" Miguel switched to a metal detector calibrated for precious metals, sweeping the area above the radar anomaly. The device immediately began producing strong signals that indicated significant quantities of metal objects buried in the same location. "Natural formations wouldn't produce metal detector readings like this," Miguel explained. "We're looking at substantial amounts of gold, silver, or other metals concentrated in a relatively small area." Elena felt her excitement building despite her fear as the evidence mounted that they had located Villa's treasure. The radar anomaly and metal detector readings were exactly what they would expect to find above a deliberately buried cache of coins, jewelry, and precious objects. "How long will it take to excavate down to the burial level?" Dr. Martinez consulted her archaeological notes. "If we work carefully to preserve any artifacts we encounter, probably 4 to 6 hours. If we're willing to work more quickly and accept some damage to secondary materials, we could reach the burial level in 2 to 3 hours. Elena weighed the options, knowing that every minute they spent excavating increased the risk of discovery by Sterling's people. But she also understood that hasty excavation might damage irreplaceable historical artifacts or destroy evidence that could verify the treasure's authenticity. "Let's work carefully but efficiently. I'd rather spend extra time excavating properly than risk destroying something that can never be replaced." Miguel began the excavation process, working with hand tools to remove the first layers of soil, while Dr. Martinez documented the process with photographs and detailed notes. Elena served as lookout, monitoring the radio for reports from the perimeter guards Miguel had posted at strategic locations around the ranch. The soil layers revealed a systematic pattern that confirmed they were excavating in the right location. Building debris from the chapel's destruction appeared at the expected depth, followed by layers of ash and burned material that corroborated historical accounts of the army's systematic destruction of the settlement. "We're finding artifacts consistent with the 1910s time period," Dr. Martinez reported, as she examined pottery fragments and metal objects recovered from the upper soil layers. Personal items, household goods, and what appeared to be military equipment fragments. Elena felt the historical significance of the discovery growing with each artifact they uncovered. Even without Villa's treasure, they were recovering evidence of a substantial community that had been largely forgotten by official history. As the excavation progressed deeper, Elena noticed that the quality and quantity of artifacts was increasing. Personal jewelry, silver coins, and religious objects suggested they were approaching areas where valuable items had been buried or hidden during the community's final evacuation. "Elena, you need to see this," Miguel called from the excavation pit. Elena joined Miguel and Dr. Martinez at the edge of the pit, looking down at a layer of carefully arranged stones that had obviously been placed deliberately rather than occurring naturally. The stones formed a rough rectangular pattern that matched the dimensions of the radar anomaly they were investigating. "This is definitely a deliberate burial," Dr. Martinez confirmed. "Someone took considerable time and effort to create a secure cache that would protect buried objects from weather and discovery." Elena felt her heart racing as she realized they were probably looking at the top of Villa's treasure cache. Everything they had hoped to find was potentially just a few feet below the stone covering that Miguel was carefully exposing. As Miguel worked to remove the protective stones, Elena maintained her lookout duties while fighting the urge to abandon. Caution and help dig. The radio crackled occasionally with reports from the perimeter guards, but so far their activities had gone undetected. "The stones are covering a wooden framework," Miguel reported. "It looks like someone built a protective chamber to keep the buried objects safe from moisture and settling." Dr. Martinez documented each stage of the excavation process, photographing the stone covering and wooden framework before they were removed. This level of preparation suggests that whoever buried these objects expected to return for them eventually. They invested significant effort in ensuring the cache would survive underground for an extended period. Elena realized that Villa's soldiers had probably planned to return after the immediate military crisis passed, never imagining that their retreat would become permanent exile, and that their carefully buried treasure would remain hidden for more than a century. Miguel finally succeeded in removing enough stones and wooden framework to reveal the actual burial chamber. Elena held her breath as powerful flashlights illuminated the interior of the cache, revealing the gleam of metal objects that had been protected from corrosion by their careful burial. "Gold," Dr. Martinez whispered. "Lots of gold." Elena stared into the burial chamber, seeing stacks of coins, jewelry, religious artifacts, and what appeared to be bars of precious metal arranged in careful rows within the protective wooden framework. The quantity of treasure was beyond anything she had imagined, representing wealth that would transform her life completely, while providing unprecedented insights into Revolutionary-era economics and culture. But even as Elena absorbed the magnitude of their discovery, the radio crackled with an urgent message from one of the perimeter guards. "Multiple vehicles approaching from the county road. Looks like the same SUVs from this morning, plus additional support vehicles. Estimate 12 to 15 people, probably armed." Elena felt her excitement transform into terror as she realized that Sterling's people had chosen this moment to make their move for Villa's treasure. The timing was too perfect to be coincidental. They had been under surveillance, and their excavation activities had been reported to people who were prepared to take the treasure by force. "How long before they reach the excavation site?" Miguel asked into the radio. 10 minutes, maybe less. They're moving fast, and they know exactly where they're going. Elena stared at the treasure they had worked all night to uncover, realizing that they were about to lose everything to criminals who had murdered her uncle and threatened her life. But they had come too far and risked too much to surrender Villa's treasure without a fight. Miguel was already moving before the radio transmission ended, grabbing weapons from the equipment cache and distributing them to Elena and Dr. Martinez, with the efficiency of someone who had prepared for exactly this scenario. Elena found herself holding a rifle she'd never fired before, her hands shaking as she tried to process the transition from archaeological discovery to armed confrontation. "We can't fight 15 people with military equipment," Dr. Martinez said, her academic composure cracking under the pressure of imminent violence. "Maybe we should try to negotiate or call for law enforcement backup." Miguel shook his head grimly as he checked his weapon and adjusted the radio frequency. "Sterling's people didn't come here to negotiate, and local law enforcement is 40 minutes away. If we're going to protect this discovery, we need to do it ourselves." Elena stared at the treasure gleaming in the excavation pit, understanding that the next few minutes would determine whether Villa's war chest would be preserved for historical study or stolen by criminals who had already killed to obtain it. The weight of her uncle's years of research and her family's connection to revolutionary history pressed down on her like a physical burden. "What's our tactical situation?" Elena asked, surprised by her own calm tone despite the terror coursing through her system. Miguel pointed toward the natural features surrounding the chapel foundation. "We have good defensive positions in these stone ruins, and the elevation gives us visibility over approaches from multiple directions. But we're outnumbered and outgunned, so our best strategy is to delay them long enough for backup to arrive." Elena wondered what kind of backup Miguel was expecting, but before she could ask, headlights became visible through the mesquite thickets as Sterling's convoy approached the excavation site. The vehicles moved with tactical precision, spreading out to encircle the chapel foundation rather than approaching directly. "Professional military organization," Dr. Martinez observed with academic detachment that seemed inappropriate for their desperate circumstances. "They've conducted similar operations before." Elena counted at least 6 vehicles positioning themselves around the excavation site, each one disgorging armed personnel who moved with the coordinated efficiency of trained soldiers. Sterling's operation was far more sophisticated than Elena had anticipated, suggesting resources and planning that extended well beyond simple treasure hunting. The floodlights Miguel had positioned for excavation work now served as tactical disadvantages, illuminating their positions while creating blind spots where Sterling's people could approach under cover of darkness. Elena realized they were trapped in a pool of light that made them perfect targets while their enemies remained hidden in the surrounding darkness. "Turn off those lights," Miguel ordered, but Elena hesitated. "If we kill the lights, we won't be able to see what we're shooting at either." Miguel was already moving toward the generator that powered the excavation lights, Better to fight in darkness than be sitting ducks in a shooting gallery. The sudden extinguishing of the floodlights plunged the excavation site into desert darkness, broken only by starlight and the distant glow of vehicle headlights. Elena's eyes struggled to adjust, leaving her feeling blind and vulnerable as sounds of movement came from multiple directions around their position. "Elena Vasquez," her amplified voice called from the darkness. Elena recognized Victoria Sterling's cultured tone, now stripped of its false friendliness and revealing the cold authority underneath. "You have something that belongs to us. We're prepared to negotiate for its return." Elena found her voice, despite her fear. "This treasure belongs to my family and to the historical record. I'm not negotiating with murderers and thieves." Sterling's laugh echoed across the excavation site with genuine amusement. "Your uncle said something very similar before we convinced him to be more reasonable. Unfortunately, his heart couldn't handle the stress of our conversation." The casual admission of murder sent rage surging through Elena's system, temporarily overwhelming her fear. Joaquin had been tortured to death by these people, probably in an attempt to extract information about the treasure's location. The archaeological discovery she'd been so excited about had cost her uncle his life. "What do you want?" Elena called back, stalling for time while trying to spot Sterling's positions in the darkness. "We want you to step away from the excavation site and allow our archaeological team to properly recover the artifacts. You can walk away with a substantial cash payment for your cooperation, or you can join your uncle in the cemetery. The choice is entirely yours." Elena noticed that Sterling referred to her people as an archaeological team, suggesting they planned to claim legitimacy for their theft by conducting a professional-appearing excavation. The stolen treasure would probably end up in private collections or black market sales rather than museums where it belonged. Miguel's voice came from somewhere to Elena's left, barely audible above the desert wind. "They're moving into position for an assault. We have maybe 2 minutes before they stop talking and start shooting." Elena realized that Sterling's negotiation was just a delaying tactic to allow her people to surround the excavation site completely. Once they had tactical superiority, any pretense of negotiation would end in favor of direct action that would leave no witnesses to their theft. "Dr. Martinez," Elena whispered toward where she'd last seen the professor. "Can you reach the radio?" "Equipment, we need to call for that backup," Miguel mentioned. Dr. Martinez's response came from an unexpected direction, suggesting she'd moved during the confusion of extinguishing the lights. "I'm trying, but they're jamming our frequencies. Professional military communication disruption." Elena felt despair beginning to overwhelm her anger as she realized how completely Sterling's people had prepared for this confrontation. They had surveillance, superior numbers, military-grade equipment, and communication jamming capabilities that suggested government-level resources or black market access to sophisticated technology. The sound of metal equipment being moved came from the excavation pit, causing Elena to realize that some of Sterling's people had already reached the treasure while she was focused on the tactical situation. They were stealing Villa's war chest even as they continued their pretense of negotiation. "They're looting the excavation," Elena called to Miguel. "We have to stop them." Miguel's response was a gunshot that shattered the desert quiet and sent Sterling's people diving for cover. Elena couldn't see what he was shooting at, but the immediate response of return fire from multiple directions confirmed that their position was completely surrounded. "Stay down and pick your targets carefully," Miguel shouted over the increasing gunfire. "We need to make every shot count." Elena had never been in a gunfight before, but her family's history of struggle and survival seemed to guide her actions as she found a defensive position among the chapel ruins and began looking for targets in the muzzle flashes surrounding their position. The rifle felt awkward in her hands, but determination to protect her uncle's legacy and prevent his murderers from profiting overcame her inexperience. The battle developed into a chaotic exchange of gunfire, punctuated by shouted commands from Sterling's people as they attempted to coordinate their assault. Elena quickly realized that their defensive position among the stone ruins was stronger than she'd initially thought, providing cover that forced Sterling's people to approach across open ground where they were vulnerable to defensive fire. "Elena, can you see the excavation pit?" Dr. Martinez called from her position behind a section of foundation wall. Elena risked a quick look toward the treasure cache, seeing flashlight beams moving systematically as Sterling's people worked to remove the most valuable artifacts. They were conducting an efficient looting operation even while maintaining the firefight, suggesting they had specific instructions about which items to prioritize. "They're taking the gold coins and jewelry first," Elena reported. "If we don't stop them soon, they'll escape with the most valuable pieces." Miguel's rifle cracked again, followed by a scream from the direction of the excavation pit. "Got one of the looters. That should slow them down." Elena felt grim satisfaction at the thought that Sterling's people were paying a price for their theft, but she also realized that injuring their personnel would probably escalate the confrontation beyond any possibility of survival. These people had already committed murder and weren't likely to leave witnesses to their archaeological theft. The radio equipment Dr. Martinez had been trying to operate suddenly crackled with an incoming transmission that managed to penetrate the communication. "Jamming. Phoenix team to Esperanza bus. We're in position and ready to provide support. Give us target coordinates." Elena felt a surge of hope as she realized that Miguel's backup had arrived, though she had no idea who Phoenix team was or how they'd managed to coordinate with the ranch's communication system despite Sterling's jamming efforts. Miguel responded immediately with tactical coordinates and a situation report that suggested familiarity with military communication protocols. "Multiple hostiles surrounding excavation site. Request immediate support on archaeological theft in progress." "Copy that, Esperanza bus. Beginning suppression fire in 30 seconds. Keep your heads down." Elena barely had time to process this exchange before the desert night erupted with gunfire from entirely new directions. Sterling's people found themselves caught between defensive fire from the chapel ruins and assault fire from Phoenix team's positions in the surrounding hills. The tactical situation reversed completely within minutes as Sterling's people realized they were no longer conducting an assault, but fighting for survival against superior forces with better positions and coordination. Elena could hear Sterling shouting orders to retreat and abandon the excavation site, but the intensity of incoming fire suggested that escape might not be possible. "Elena, we need to secure the treasure before anyone else gets killed," Miguel called. "Can you reach the excavation pit?" Elena looked toward the treasure cache, seeing that Sterling's people had abandoned their looting operation to focus on the firefight. This might be her only chance to protect Villa's war chest from theft, but reaching the excavation site would require crossing open ground under fire. Dr. Martinez made the decision for her, sprinting from her defensive position toward the treasure. With the reckless courage of someone who valued historical preservation above personal safety, Elena watched in horror as gunfire tracked the professor's movement, knowing that Dr. Martinez was risking her life to save artifacts that belonged in museums rather than private collections. Elena found herself running before she'd consciously decided to move, following Dr. Martinez toward the excavation pit while Miguel provided covering fire. The distance seemed to expand as she ran, with each step taking forever while bullets whined past her head and kicked up dust around her feet. She reached the excavation pit just as Dr. Martinez disappeared into the treasure cache, emerging with armloads of gold coins and jewelry that she passed to Elena before diving back down for more artifacts. Elena stuffed precious objects into every pocket and container she could find, working frantically to preserve as much of Villa's treasure as possible. "Elena, get out of there!" Miguel shouted. "Sterling's people are regrouping for another assault." Elena looked up from the treasure cache to see muzzle flashes moving closer as Sterling's remaining personnel attempted to retake control of the excavation site. Dr. Martinez was still in the pit, passing up religious artifacts and silver bars that represented irreplaceable historical evidence as well as enormous monetary value. The sound of helicopters approaching from multiple directions added a new dimension to the chaos, suggesting that the confrontation had attracted official attention from law enforcement or military authorities. Elena wondered if the helicopters represented rescue or additional danger, but the immediate threat from Sterling's people required all her attention. Phoenix Team's suppression fire intensified as Sterling's assault approached the excavation site, creating a desperate three-way battle that made Elena realize she might die protecting treasure that would end up scattered across the desert if the fighting continued much longer. "Dr. Martinez, we have to go now," Elena shouted into the excavation pit. Dr. Martinez emerged with the last armload of artifacts just as Sterling's people reached effective range of the treasure cache. Elena grabbed the professor's arm and they ran for the chapel ruins, carrying as much of Villa's war chest as they could manage while gunfire erupted around them. They reached the defensive positions just as the helicopters arrived overhead, flooding the excavation site with searchlights that revealed the full scope of the battle. Elena could see Sterling's people clearly for the first time, noting their military-style equipment and professional tactical formations that confirmed they were far more than simple treasure hunters. The helicopter searchlights also revealed Phoenix Team's positions, showing Elena that their backup consisted of at least a dozen heavily armed personnel who had established a perimeter around the entire excavation area. Whatever organization Miguel had contacted for help, they had responded with overwhelming force and professional military capabilities. Elena clutched the rescued artifacts against her chest, feeling the weight of gold and silver that represented both enormous wealth and her family's connection to revolutionary history. But even as she celebrated saving part of Villa's treasure, she realized that the confrontation was far from over, and that Sterling's people might represent just the beginning of the dangers she would face as the owner of one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in American history. The helicopter searchlights revealed a scene that looked more like a military battlefield than an archaeological excavation, with armed personnel in tactical positions around the chapel ruins and the desert floor littered with equipment from Sterling's aborted assault. Elena pressed herself against the stone foundation, still clutching the rescued artifacts while trying to process the dramatic reversal that had saved their lives. One of the helicopters began broadcasting through powerful speakers, the amplified voice carrying clearly across the excavation site, despite the continuing gunfire. "This is Agent Sarah Rodriguez, FBI. All personnel are ordered to lay down weapons immediately and surrender for questioning regarding federal crimes including murder, conspiracy, and theft of historical artifacts." Elena felt a mixture of relief and confusion as she realized that law enforcement had arrived, but she wasn't certain whether FBI involvement represented rescue or additional complications. The treasure she'd recovered might be subject to federal seizure pending investigation, and her own role in the armed confrontation could lead to criminal charges despite her legitimate ownership of the ranch. Sterling's voice cut through the night air with desperate authority as she attempted to maintain control of her deteriorating operation. "Agent Rodriguez, this is a private business dispute over property rights. Sterling Development has legitimate claims to archaeological materials discovered on land we've contracted to purchase." Elena felt outrage surge through her system at Sterling's attempt to legitimize theft and murder through false legal claims. "She's lying!" Elena shouted toward the helicopters. "Sterling Development threatened me this morning and admitted to murdering my uncle. They're thieves trying to steal my family's inheritance." The FBI agent's response was immediate and decisive. "Victoria Sterling, you're under arrest for conspiracy, murder, and violations of federal archaeological protection laws. Order your personnel to surrender immediately or face additional charges for resisting federal authorities." Elena watched as Sterling's remaining people began laying down their weapons and emerging from defensive positions with their hands visible. The professional military organization that had seemed so threatening just minutes earlier dissolved rapidly when confronted with federal law enforcement backed by superior firepower and legal authority. Miguel appeared at Elena's side, his rifle still ready, but pointed safely toward the ground. "Phoenix Team is FBI tactical support," he explained quietly. "Your uncle had been working with federal authorities for months to build a case against Sterling's organization." Elena stared at Miguel in amazement, realizing that her uncle's preparations had been far more sophisticated than she'd understood. "He was working with the FBI?" Dr. Martinez emerged from her defensive position, still carrying archaeological equipment despite the chaos of the firefight. "Joaquin contacted federal authorities when he first suspected that his research was attracting criminal attention. The FBI had been building a case against a network of criminal organizations that specialize in stealing archaeological treasures." Elena began to understand that her uncle's death had been part of a federal investigation rather than an isolated incident. Sterling's people weren't just treasure hunters. They were part of a criminal network that the FBI had been tracking across multiple states and potentially international boundaries. Agent Rodriguez's helicopter landed near the excavation site, disgorging a team of federal agents who immediately began securing the scene and processing Sterling's captured personnel. Elena watched as Sterling herself was led away in handcuffs, her expensive suit torn and dirty from the desert firefight. "Ms. Vasquez," Agent Rodriguez called as she approached the chapel ruins. "I'm sorry for the dramatic circumstances, but we needed Sterling's people to commit federal crimes in the presence of FBI witnesses before we could make arrests that would result in convictions." Elena felt a chill as she realized the implications of what Agent Rodriguez had said. "You used me as bait to lure Sterling's people into a trap." Agent Rodriguez's expression was apologetic, but unapologetic. "Your uncle volunteered to serve as the primary target for Sterling's organization. Knowing the risks involved, when he was killed, you inherited not just his ranch, but also his role in our ongoing investigation." Elena struggled with anger at having been manipulated by federal authorities who had risked her life without her knowledge or consent. But she also understood that bringing Sterling's people to justice required evidence of their criminal activities that could only be obtained by allowing them to attempt their planned theft. "What happens to Villa's treasure now?" Agent Rodriguez gestured toward the excavation pit where FBI archaeological specialists were already beginning to document and secure the remaining artifacts. "The treasure will be processed as evidence in federal court, but ultimately it belongs to you as the legal owner of the property where it was discovered." However, the historical significance of the discovery means that federal and state authorities will want to ensure proper preservation and study. Elena felt relief that she wouldn't lose Villa's treasure to government seizure. But she also understood that owning such a significant archaeological discovery would bring responsibilities and complications she hadn't anticipated. Museums, universities, and historical preservation organizations would all have legitimate interests in studying and displaying the artifacts. Dr. Martinez approached with obvious excitement despite the trauma of the evening's events. "Elena, this discovery is going to revolutionize our understanding of Villa's activities in Texas. The artifacts we recovered represent the most complete collection of Revolutionary-era material culture ever found in the United States." Elena looked at the gold coins and jewelry she still clutched against her chest, trying to comprehend the transition from desperate poverty to ownership of historically priceless artifacts. The monetary value alone would provide financial security beyond anything she'd imagined, but the historical significance added dimensions of responsibility that felt overwhelming. Miguel joined their conversation, his weathered face showing relief and satisfaction. "Your uncle would be proud of what you accomplished tonight. You saved his life's work from criminals and ensured that Villa's treasure will be preserved for future generations." Elena felt tears welling up as she thought about her uncle's dedication to historical preservation and the price he'd paid for his commitment to protecting Villa's legacy. The treasure they'd recovered represented not just monetary wealth, but validation of Joaquin's research and sacrifice. Agent Rodriguez interrupted their conversation with information about the broader investigation. Sterling's organization was responsible for archaeological thefts across 7 states, including several cases where property owners were murdered when they refused to sell land containing historical treasures. Your uncle's cooperation helped us identify the full scope of their criminal network. Elena absorbed this information, understanding that her uncle's death had contributed to bringing down a criminal organization that had terrorized honest researchers and property owners throughout the Southwest. The justice achieved tonight extended far beyond recovering Villa's treasure. What about the other people who were killed by Sterling's organization? Will their families see justice? Agent Rodriguez nodded seriously. Tonight's arrests and the evidence we've gathered will allow us to prosecute Sterling's people for multiple murders and thefts. The families of other victims will finally see their loved ones' killers brought to trial. Elena felt a sense of closure beginning to develop as she realized that her uncle's murder would not go unpunished and that his killers would face consequences for their crimes. The fear and anger that had driven her actions throughout the night were being replaced by satisfaction that justice was being served. As FBI agents continued processing the crime scene and documenting the archaeological discovery, Elena found herself standing at the edge of the excavation pit, looking down at the treasure cache that had been the center of so much violence and sacrifice. The wooden framework and protective stones that Villa's soldiers had carefully arranged more than a century ago had preserved artifacts that bridged the gap between historical legend and documented reality. The oral histories were accurate, Dr. Martinez said, joining Elena at the excavation site. Everything we found matches the descriptions passed down through families for over 100 years. Villa's war chest was exactly where the stories said it would be. Elena marveled at the persistence of oral tradition that had preserved accurate information across multiple generations, despite official history's dismissal of the treasure stories as folklore. The families who had maintained these stories, despite skepticism from historians and archaeologists, had been vindicated by the night's discoveries. What happens next with the archaeological investigation? Dr. Martinez gestured toward the FBI, specialists who were still working to document and recover artifacts from the burial chamber. This site will require months of careful excavation and analysis. We've only recovered the most obvious treasures. There may be additional caches or artifacts that require systematic archaeological investigation. Elena realized that her inheritance had evolved from a simple ranch property into an active archaeological site that would attract researchers, tourists, and media attention for years to come. The quiet, rural life she'd initially sought in Texas had been replaced by responsibilities that would connect her to academic institutions, government agencies, and historical preservation organizations. Miguel approached with practical concerns about the immediate future. Elena, we need to discuss security arrangements for the ranch. Tonight's events have probably attracted attention from other criminal organizations and treasure hunters who will want to search for additional artifacts. Elena hadn't considered that finding Villa's treasure might attract other criminals rather than eliminating the threats she faced. The publicity surrounding the discovery would probably draw treasure hunters from across the country, creating ongoing security challenges that would require professional management. Agent Rodriguez overheard their conversation and offered federal assistance. The FBI can provide temporary security support while you establish permanent protection for the archaeological site. Given the historical significance of the discovery, federal authorities have legitimate interests in ensuring proper preservation. Elena appreciated the offer of federal protection, but she also understood that accepting government assistance would probably involve surrendering some control over her property and the artifacts discovered on it. The independence she'd sought through inheritance was being complicated by the magnitude of what she'd inherited. As dawn began to break over the desert landscape, Elena could see the full scope of the night's events. The excavation site looked like a combination archaeological dig and military battlefield, with FBI agents, archaeological specialists, and tactical support personnel working to process evidence and secure the discovery. The chapel foundation, that had been hidden beneath desert vegetation for decades was now exposed and documented, revealing architectural details that would help historians understand the original settlement's layout and purpose. Even without Villa's treasure, the site represented a significant archaeological discovery that would contribute to understanding of Revolutionary-era communities. Elena walked back toward the ranch house as FBI agents continued their work, carrying the artifacts she'd personally rescued from Sterling's attempted theft. The gold coins felt heavy in her pockets, representing wealth that would transform her life while connecting her to historical events that had shaped the entire Southwest. Dr. Martinez accompanied her, still energized by the academic significance of the discovery despite the exhaustion and trauma of the night's violence. Elena, I hope you'll consider allowing the university to establish a research program here. This site could become one of the most important archaeological locations in Texas. Elena considered the proposal, understanding that university involvement would provide academic legitimacy and research support, while potentially generating income that could help maintain the ranch and support ongoing archaeological work. The isolation that had initially attracted her to rural Texas was about to be replaced by constant activity from researchers, students, and visitors. As they reached the ranch house, Elena realized that her life had been completely transformed in less than 24 hours. Yesterday morning, she'd been a struggling farm worker with no prospects beyond manual labor. This morning, she was the owner of one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in American history, with responsibilities that extended far beyond personal financial security. The sunrise illuminated a landscape that looked the same as it had the previous morning, but that Elena now understood contained layers of history and significance she was only beginning to comprehend. Villa's treasure was just the beginning of discoveries that would probably continue for years, as systematic archaeological investigation revealed the full extent of the Revolutionary-era settlement. Elena sat on the ranch house porch, watching FBI agents and archaeological specialists continue their work, while she tried to process the magnitude of the changes in her circumstances. The quiet inheritance she'd expected had become an adventure that connected her to historical events, federal law enforcement, and academic institutions in ways she could never have imagined. But as the morning light revealed the extent of the night's discoveries, Elena felt a deep satisfaction that her uncle's work had been vindicated and that Villa's treasure would be preserved for future generations rather than stolen by criminals. The price paid in fear, violence, and her uncle's life had been enormous, but the historical justice achieved made the sacrifice meaningful. 3 months later, Elena stood in the grand hallway of the Smithsonian Institution, watching as the final display case was carefully positioned in the new Villa's War Chest, Revolutionary Treasures of the Texas Borderlands exhibition. The gold coins and silver artifacts that had nearly cost her life now gleamed under museum lighting, each piece accompanied by detailed descriptions that told the story of Villa's raiders and the communities that supported them. It's incredible to see them displayed like this, Dr. Martinez said, joining Elena in front of the centerpiece display that featured the ornate silver chalice they'd discovered in the deepest part of the cache. These artifacts are telling stories that have been hidden for over a century. Elena nodded, still amazed by the transformation of her life since that terrifying night at the chapel foundation. The Smithsonian exhibition was just one of several, Museum displays featuring Villa's treasure, with artifacts also traveling to institutions in Mexico, Texas, and California. The discovery had become an international sensation that brought together historians, archaeologists, and treasure enthusiasts from around the world. The financial rewards had been substantial as well. Elena's agreement with the Smithsonian included a multi-million-dollar payment for the loan of major artifacts, while her partnership with the University of Texas had established an endowment that would fund archaeological research on the ranch for decades to come. The struggling farm worker who had arrived in Texas with nothing now had resources that would last multiple lifetimes. But the real satisfaction came from seeing her uncle's vision fulfilled. Joaquin had dreamed of Villa's treasure being preserved and studied rather than sold to private collectors, and the museum exhibitions were achieving exactly that goal. Thousands of visitors each week were learning about revolutionary history and the Mexican-American communities that had shaped the Southwest. Elena's phone buzzed with a text message from Miguel, who had remained as ranch foreman while also serving as site manager for the ongoing archaeological excavations. Another discovery today. Looks like we found the community's blacksmith shop. Dr. Martinez will want to see this immediately. Elena smiled, knowing that each new discovery added pieces to the historical puzzle that Joaquin had spent years trying to solve. The ranch had been transformed into a working archaeological site that continued to yield artifacts and insights about Revolutionary-era life along the border. The legal proceedings had concluded with complete vindication for Elena and lengthy prison sentences for Sterling's organization. Victoria Sterling herself had been convicted of multiple murders and sentenced to life imprisonment, while her associates received sentences ranging from 20 to 50 years. The FBI's investigation had uncovered similar criminal operations across 7 states, leading to additional arrests and convictions that had disrupted an entire network of archaeological thieves. Agent Rodriguez had remained in contact, providing updates on related cases and offering ongoing security consultation for the ranch. The federal protection had been necessary during the initial media attention, but the site now maintained its own professional security that allowed public access while protecting ongoing research. Elena had also established the Joaquin Morales Foundation, dedicated to supporting archaeological research and protecting indigenous and Mexican-American historical sites throughout the Southwest. The Foundation's work extended far beyond Villa's treasure, funding projects that preserved and studied the broader cultural heritage of borderland communities. Dr. Martinez approached with a tablet displaying photographs from the morning's excavation. "Elena, you need to see what Miguel's team discovered today. We think they found evidence of a second treasure cache." Elena examined the images, seeing metal detector readings and ground-penetrating radar data that suggested another buried collection of artifacts. The possibility of additional discoveries meant that the archaeological significance of Esperanza Ranch would continue growing for years to come. The oral histories mention multiple burial sites, Elena remembered. Villa's forces probably created several caches to reduce the risk of losing everything to a single discovery. Dr. Martinez nodded excitedly. "If that's true, we may have found just the beginning of what Villa's soldiers buried on your property. The ranch could contain enough archaeological material to support research for decades." Elena felt the familiar thrill of discovery that had driven her uncle's passion. for historical research. Each new find connected her more deeply to the revolutionary events that had shaped her family's heritage and the broader history of the Southwest. As they left the Smithsonian, Elena reflected on the incredible journey that had brought her from desperate unemployment to ownership of one of America's most significant archaeological discoveries. The inheritance she'd initially viewed as a simple financial opportunity had become a life mission that connected her to academic institutions, government agencies, and historical preservation organizations worldwide. The drive back to Texas would take her through landscapes that now held personal meaning, rather than being simply empty desert. Every mile of the journey represented part of the historical narrative that Villa's treasure had helped illuminate, from the revolutionary raids that had shaped border communities to the families who had preserved oral traditions across multiple generations. Elena's phone rang as she prepared to board her flight to Austin, showing Miguel's number on the display. "Elena, you're not going to believe what we just found in the blacksmith shop excavation." "More artifacts?" Miguel's voice was filled with excitement. "Documents. Villa's soldiers cached written records along with the treasure, maps, correspondence, maybe even official orders that could rewrite the historical understanding of the Columbus raid." Elena felt her pulse quicken with the familiar excitement of historical discovery. "And I'll be back on the ranch tomorrow morning. Don't let anyone else see those documents until I get there." Already secured. But Elena, there's something else. These documents suggest that Villa buried treasure caches at multiple locations across South Texas. Your ranch might be just one site in a much larger network. Elena absorbed this information, understanding that her inheritance might have connected her to discoveries that could reshape historical understanding of the entire revolutionary period. The responsibility was daunting, but the opportunity to contribute to historical knowledge was exactly what Joaquin had dreamed of achieving. As her plane lifted off from Washington, D.C., Elena looked down at the landscape below and thought about the adventures that still awaited her in Texas. Villa's treasure had been just the beginning of discoveries that would probably continue for the rest of her life, each new find adding pieces to the historical puzzle that connected past and present. The quiet farm woman who had inherited a ranch 3 months ago was now a historical preservation advocate, archaeological site manager, and guardian of cultural treasures that belonged to all humanity. The transformation had been dramatic and sometimes terrifying, but Elena couldn't imagine returning to her previous life of financial insecurity and limited horizons. The adventure that had begun with a threatening visit from Sterling Development had evolved into a lifetime mission that honored her uncle's memory while preserving important cultural heritage for future generations. Villa's Revolutionary War Chest had provided not just financial security, but purpose and meaning that would last far beyond any monetary reward. If you've enjoyed Elena's incredible journey from struggling farm worker to guardian of revolutionary treasure, we'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Tell us where you're watching from and what you'd do if you inherited mysterious property with hidden historical secrets. And make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because tomorrow we're bringing you the absolutely mind-blowing story of a lighthouse keeper who discovered her tower was built on top of a Civil War spy network that had been operating in secret for over 150 years. Trust us, you won't want to miss it.